So, this is the last session of the day. As Larry said, we are really talking about ACI 318 and its applications as sort of a theme running through this workshop. So now I'm going to actually talk about ACI 318. I am not going to present hundreds of slides. In fact, I'm going to present 35 slides to cover the basics, and then I want to leave plenty of time for question and answer if there are questions. If not, we'll go have a drink or something before the reception, right? The reception starts at 5:30, I believe. Yeah. Okay. So here I am. That's me. So I must be in the right place. I'd like to talk about the next edition of the code, which is ACI 318.25, and we do expect to publish it early in 2025. So we're just about there. And at this convention and the next convention, we will be putting the final touches on the code. So at this point, I can talk about some of the major themes that are appearing in the new code and what we can expect. I'm trying to see who we have here who's involved in 318. Larry and Jim. Who else? Okay. I apologize if some of this might be very users of ACI 318 might already be aware of some of this information, but I thought since this is an international workshop, I would try to cover some of the basics as well. All right, I'm going to talk about four topics. The second one actually is rather short. You'll see I'm just going to tell you where we stand in 2025 in terms of basically our production of the code. And then in the third part, I will talk about what is coming in ACI 318.25. And as I said, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So first off, part A. I want to describe the current code, which is ACI 318.2019, and some of the main features of it. More about the structure of the code and the philosophy behind the code, because that's a very important aspect of the 318 building code is the philosophy behind it. The organization and in some respects the philosophy changed in the 2014 edition. We carried that organizational change through to 2019, and we will continue with that same approach in 2025. So that philosophical underpinning of 318 is what I'd like to talk about in the context of the current code, which is the 2019 edition. So just going back, I didn't know that Pepe was going to, was it? Yes, you described like the history of the code. Actually, I have a whole bunch of slides like Pepe on, where it all came from and everything, but I'm not going to go through that. But the first printed regulations were in 1908. The first sort of code thing that might be considered a code was 1910. And then between 1910 and the 2014 or 2019 edition, there have been 22 editions of the code. So it's been a very active document. It's been frequently revised. It's been we revise the code through a consensus standard process, which is designed to guarantee that minority opinions are heard and considered, and that there's a general consensus. And as a result, I think it's really a very solid, up-to-date document. It continues to be, based on the number of revisions or additions that we've made. The code has updated in intervals anywhere from 3 to 6 years or so. Actually, I think there might be a longer period in there. But this is all of the editions of the code from 1908 through 2014. And I know this is a little hard to read, so I'm going to read every line here, starting at the top. No, just kidding. These are all 22 editions, but you can, the spacing in terms of intervals, it's not terribly regular. We see 2 years, then an interval of 10 years, 7 years, 6 years, 5, 6, so on and so forth. In the current edition, we went from 2014 to 2019, and the next edition will be 2025. So we're looking at a 6-year interval. Some of this is driven, especially in the later years here, the last couple of decades, by the overarching building code that references ACI 318, which is the International Building Code. And we had quite a bit of information this morning about codes in the U.S. and how they've developed. But the main point of that is the ACI code 318 is referenced by a sort of a master building code, typically, which is the International Building Code, IBC. ACI 318 is also referenced by a number of other documents, important regulatory documents in the U.S., including ASCE 7, which is our loads document, ASCE 41, which is our document for evaluation, seismic evaluation and rehabilitation of buildings, and a number of other documents. So it's a key part of the concrete design landscape in the United States. So, moving along, what is the current version? I've mentioned it's 318.19, and there's a parenthetical 22 there after it, and the next edition will come out, we believe in January. It will be published electronically, and then the printed edition will be available a month or two later. It has to go to the printers and get printed and bound and mailed back and everything. You might be wondering, what is that 22 that follows the 19? Does that mean that there was a different edition of the code in 2022? Not really. In 2022, we made some minor updates to the code just to fix errata, so typographical errors, very small things. We also updated some of the reference standards, the ASTM standards, and other standards that are cited by 318. We brought those up to date, but we didn't make any technical changes. So if you have an edition of the 318.19 code, you can be comfortable in continuing to use it, whether it has that 22 after it or not. The 22 is just a slightly refined version, but the technical content hasn't changed. I'll also just mention that the ACI website, I think it's actually, you can access it from the homepage of ACI, has links to document errata. So if you have maybe a first printing of ACI 318.19 and you want to check if anything, what has been fixed, what little errors, typographical things have been changed, that's available for free. You can download it. It's just a list of all the things that were misspelled or the subscript was wrong on a variable or something like that. So it's a long way of saying you don't need to get a 22 edition of ACI 318.19. You can go ahead and use whatever edition you have. Just make sure you check the errata. Okay. So what I want to spend, I mentioned I was going to talk about the philosophy of the organization of the 318 code. I'm going to do it in the context of the current edition, 318.19. But most and probably all of these were introduced in 318.14, which was the edition where we completely reorganized the code. We changed the basis of the presentation of all the provisions very radically. We didn't change much the underlying technical aspects of the code. We changed the way it was organized and presented. So I just wanted to start off by pointing to the current code, 318.19, Chapter 4, which was a new chapter that appeared in the 2014 edition. This is one of those chapters that you may have never turned to intentionally. There's not much there that is referenced from other parts in the code that send you to Chapter 4. But it's a really important chapter for understanding the code overall. It's basically a roadmap to the code. It's titled Structural System Requirements, but in order to understand how the 318 code works, where to go to design certain types of systems, and so on, you really should be familiar with Chapter 4. So it's worth spending a little time looking at it. There's a scope section at the beginning that explains what the chapter is. And then there are 12 subsections. They're shown in this colorful diagram here. There's actually no reason they should be in a circle or anything. That's just kind of a graphic. And the colors actually don't really relate to anything. But it's an interesting graphic. Anyway, what we're really interested in is the words in the boxes. For instance, at the top, general information on materials and where to go to find out about cementitious materials and reinforcement and so on, embeds, design loads, where do you go to find design loads, and so on. We get around to sustainability, we get to fire safety, precast, pre-stressed, and so on. All of those things are described in Chapter 4, and they tell you which other sections of the code you need to look at to comply with the requirements for those topics. So I recommend, if you haven't worked with ACI 318 or are wanting a refresher, that you go ahead and just spend a little time looking at Chapter 4. It'll get you started in the right direction. All right, so then we have there are 27 chapters in ACI 318, and we can, if we look at them, we can kind of group them into themes. One of them is general. That's like Chapter 1. It describes the applicability of the code, what the meanings of how you should interpret the code, and so on. It is very general stuff. Systems, that would include Chapter 4 that I just described, looks at overall organization and usage of the code. Members is very important chapter, or grouping of chapters. These are chapters that are devoted to design of a specific type of member. So you will find member chapters such as beams, one-way slabs, two-way slabs. The reason for those chapters, and those are all new, the material in them isn't new, but we brought from 318.08, we reorganized and put everything into what's called a member-based code organization. That was the main thematic update to the code in 2014. It's now a members-based code, and what does that mean? If you, as an engineer, are designing a particular kind of member, find the chapter with that member name. Then you will go through that chapter, and if you consult everything in that chapter, let's just say the beams chapter, when you get to the end and you've considered all of those provisions, you can be confident that you have correctly analyzed, designed, and detailed the beams. Previously, the provisions for, say, designing a beam or a column were spread all over the code, and you just had to know through experience where to go, but you could very easily miss something if you weren't completely aware of everything that was in the code. Other themes are joints and connections, the so-called Toolbox chapters that I'll discuss in a moment, and construction, which is generally in chapter 26. These are things that the engineer needs to tell the contractor. So the code, 318.19, is a document written to the engineer, to direct the engineer about how to design concrete structures. The code is not written to the contractor. Very specifically, it is not written to the contractor. Putting provisions in the 318 code that direct the contractor to do A, B, or C is useless because the contractor is not, number one, familiar with the code, not responsible for complying with 318.19. What the contractor is responsible for is complying with the construction documents, including any instructions from the engineer. So chapter 26, this construction chapter, tells the engineer what the engineer must tell the contractor. So it's a very important chapter. It's way in the back there, but it's really key. All right, so I want to talk about, I mentioned the member-based organization of the code, and I want to just briefly touch on that. Here are the member chapters. I said, you know, if you have a particular kind of member that you're designing, a beam or a column or a wall, these are the chapters you go to. So this was the, I think, genius of the reorganization in 318.14 was to group everything in a way that the users of the code, engineers, approach design. So we have loads, detailing requirements, analysis requirements, and so on for each type of member in each chapter. So there are a total of, 8 member chapters. This doesn't mean you can only design these kinds of members with ACI 318. You can apply the general principles of ACI 318 to designing other types of elements, but these are by far the most common. So let me illustrate what why we went through all the work of reorganizing the code in 2014. This is an illustration that shows for the 2011 edition of ACI 318 all of the provisions required to design this portion of this column. It's a column that intersects with a slab. There's a lap joint there, and there's confining reinforcement. This is a gravity column, obviously, because those ties are quite far apart, rather than a moment frame column. But if we look at the numbers there, we see references to Chapter 7, Chapter 12, Chapter 11, Chapter 9, and Chapter 10. 5 different chapters and about 7 different areas to look in. So it's kind of a nightmare, really. I mean, people who do this day in and day out know, okay, I got to, I had to go there, there, and there. And, but people new to it, or if you're trying to teach this in a university setting, it's really was kind of a mess. So this is what we did. We created Chapter 10 is the columns chapter. And if you look at all the numbers here, I don't know if you can read them, that green's a little light. These are all subsections of Chapter 10. So when you're designing this column, you follow through Chapter 10 from beginning to end. And if you're satisfied that you have complied with all of those requirements, you have properly designed the column according to ACI 318. So this is what we're doing. We did in 14 and 19, and this same principle carries through into 25. All right. One other group of chapters that's very important to the organization of the code is the so-called Toolbox chapters. I'm not going to talk about all of these kind of groupings of subjects because we have an all-day seminar for that if we wanted to spend that much time. I'm just touching on the most important sort of underlying philosophy here. So we have these Toolbox chapters, and that's kind of an interesting designation. And actually, this is a tool bag, not a toolbox, but we won't get hung up on that. The toolbox chapters, as the name implies, are provisions that you want to consult often as a designer when you're designing multiple kinds of members. For example, Chapter 21 contains all the strength reduction factors. Those are the phi factors for load and resistance factor design. These are, the phi factors are all in Chapter 21, except for a few having to do with some specialty items. But by and large, they're all in Chapter 21. So if you were designing a beam, you would go find your phi factor in Chapter 21. A slab, you go find your phi factor in Chapter 21. A footing, go look for your phi factors there. The idea is that if you're designing a member or an element, you you go out to that toolbox chapter, rummage around in it, find what you need, and then you come right back to where you were in the members chapter. The same goes for the toolbox chapter called sectional strength, a really fundamental key chapter because it's in that chapter where you're told how to calculate or what the allowable flexural strength, shear strength, torsional strength, and a couple other things that you can rely on for a member. And this applies to all types of members. Shear strength of a column, shear strength in a slab, shear strength in a one-way slab, two-way slab, beam, anything, a wall. And so all of these these toolbox chapters are general purpose chapters. The strut and tie, Larry, I'm going to get this wrong, is the strut and tie method? Okay, I got it right. It's been a long-running controversy. Yeah, okay, but I got it right. Okay, strut and tie method. Serviceability considerations like deflections and like chloride and freezing performance categories. And then another really important chapter is reinforcement details. We design all kinds of different things out of concrete, but a lot of the rules for detailing, like hooks, confining hoops or stirrups, they're common to a lot of different kind of members. So this is where you would go to Chapter 25 and find the detail you need, and then go right back to the chapter that you're where you're working with design of a particular element. I want to point out something that's kind of a subtlety, but does cause problems sometimes, especially with building officials or the building department or whoever is overseeing or the authority having jurisdiction is the formal name. The authority who is approving a design for construction occasionally will look in one of the toolbox chapters, 21 through 25, and say, look at this right here, you didn't comply with this. And you as the engineer would say, yes, of course I didn't, because I was designing a such and such, and you don't need to meet that detail. That's a toolbox chapter. There's never any reference in the, let's say, two-way slab design provisions to complying with that detailing requirement in Chapter 25. But it's still, the stuff in Chapter 25 is still in the code, and so the building official is saying, yeah, but it's in the code. You have to comply with it. This has happened a number of times for us, and it has done absolutely no good for me to say, oh, those are what the ACI Code Committee calls toolbox chapters. They are never, we never go directly to a toolbox chapter. We're always referred there by something else. And very often the response is, well, that's all well and good, but it's in the code and I am legally bound to enforce the code. So just beware of that. We're trying to get some a fix or a clarification of that, but that does happen sometimes. Okay, so if we look then at an example of this toolbox chapter reference, here we're designing a beam in Chapter 9. We get to Section 9.5. And when we get down to calculating the nominal moment strength, or phi m sub n, it says go to section 22.3. So we go there. It gives us calculating the moment strength of a general concrete section, not a beam, just these are the basic principles for finding the moment strength, m sub n, of a concrete section. When you get done with that, that's why this arrow there's an arrow on both ends of this line. You go right back to section 9.5. You don't then wander off into some other chapter. And we've tried to be very careful about making the Toolbox chapters a place where you go for one thing or two things and you come right back. And then if we get down to a little lower there, if you have a high axial load on your beam, then you have to calculate phi m sub n a little different way, and it sends you to 22.4. You go there and you come right back. So that's an illustration of how these Toolbox chapters are used. Okay, and all of the member chapters have essentially the same organization. That is, this is an example for Chapter 9 beams, but these subsections 9.1 through 9.7 are the same pattern that is followed for every member chapter. So in Chapter 10 on columns, you'll see 10.1 through 10.7, and those topics are addressed in each one. So we're trying to clarify and make more predictable and more understandable the process of designing each type of member. Okay, so everything up to this point, I've just been explaining what the 318 code currently is, how we got there, and the underlying philosophy of how it's organized and laid out. Next, part B, is actually just one slide. I'm going to explain where we are with the 2025 edition, at least in terms of the timeline of development and so on, just so you can understand where we are in the process currently. So very soon after publication of the 2019 code, which was earlier in 2019, we formed the committee for the 2025 edition. I was appointed chair by the Technical Activities Committee of ACI, and then I appointed all of the members of ACI 318. There are, I think it's 51 or 2 voting members of the 318 main committee, and then there are 15 subcommittees. And there are some members of 318 who are members only of subcommittees, but not the main committee. And if you count up all the people on the main committee and the subcommittee members, there's about 150 people involved. So it's a big group. Of course, all 150 of us always agree on everything, so it's very easy to work with 150 engineers. In any case, we're getting to the end of the process for 2025. So between spring 2020 and fall of 2023, we actually held 12 full committee meetings. Some of those, I'd say about a third of them, were virtual because we didn't have any conventions. Normally we have our code committee meetings at conventions. During COVID, we had virtual meetings, and it's a lot of fun to run a Zoom meeting with 52 people on it. But to my delight, everyone was very well behaved, raised their hand when they wanted to speak. We actually got a lot of work done on those virtual meetings. There's no way it takes the place of an in-person meeting, but we made a lot of progress. So we had 12 meetings. We had we balloted change proposals, debated them, resolved comments and negative votes and so on, and gradually revised the code, approaching the end of the cycle right about now. So we're in spring 2024 where the arrow is. We are currently in an internal technical review process with the ACI Technical Activities Committee where we have comments 470 of them, no, 360 of them from the Technical Activities Committee that we are responding to. In terms of the responses to those comments, we have 471 or 470 different opinions about how we should respond to those 361 comments. And our work at this convention on Wednesday is to settle all that. It's going to be fun. During the summer, at some point, I'm sorry, I missed a very important thing, the second bullet item under spring 2024. In May, we will release the code to the public, meaning anyone who wants to log on to the ACI 318 website and review the full draft of the code, every chapter, every page of ACI 318.25 will be available for viewing, and we also accept public comments. That is, if a member of the public, particularly a code user who has a comment about the way that the 2025 code is formatted in the draft or the content, they can submit a comment. ACI 318, the committee, is obligated to respond to every public comment. And that, if we thought the TAC comment and response process was complicated, public response is a whole nother ball game. So this public comment period is open for 45 days, and then we, as a committee, respond to all of the public comments. We may make changes in response to them. We may explain why we don't think that the comment should result in a change, and so on. But we have to respond to every public comment. There's another internal technical review behind the scenes there. And then in the fall of this year, we'll do the final editing. ACI staff will look at things. We'll get final approval from the ACI board level committee that approves standards, and ACI staff will work on the exact layout of the code, the final layout, and then it will be published. First it'll come out electronically, and then a little later a paper version. I want to mention the electronic publication because, and I have a little advertisement slide a little later on, but there's a platform called 318 Plus with ACI. It's an electronic version of the code. It's fully searchable. You can write your own notes there, and it will keep your notes with, instead of writing in the margins of your paper code, you can put your notes there. It has links to published papers, if the papers are published by ACI. It has it has hyperlinks between provisions and so on, like if you're going to a Toolbox chapter and want to go back. It's a very handy tool. The public comment version that will be released in May will be released on the 318 Plus platform. So if you want to look at the code and comment on it, you will sign in to the online version, ACI 318 Plus, and the version that will be posted there will be the draft or public review version. When the code is finally published electronically in its final approved form we hope in January of 2025, it will also be first published on the ACI 318 Plus platform, and you can then access it that way, or if you prefer a physical copy, that will be available a little while later. But I just wanted to point out that we're really moving towards an era of electronic codes. Well, I don't think paper codes will ever go away, and I prefer paper codes. But sometimes I like the electronic version so I can look up keywords and so on. So just be aware that that's how the next version of the code is rolling out, is electronically. All right. So going on to the last part having to do with describing the code and where we stand. We have been doing a lot of work over the past 5.5 years, and I just want to describe to you some of the major trends that we're seeing and likely updates to ACI 318.25. I won't go into a great amount of detail for a couple of reasons. One, it would take a very long time, and two, since the code is still in process, we are obligated to keep the work of the code committee confidential within the committee until it's finally approved. I can talk in general terms about what's coming, but I can't, for instance, put what I think the code language is going to be for 318.25 of a particular section. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but it's just the way the rules work in ACI. So I won't be talking in great detail, but I do want to give you an idea of what the major themes are that are coming in the next version of the code, which is, going to be with us in about another 9 months. So these bullet items describe some of the most important themes that we've been working on. We will have a new appendix on, and I'm going to talk about these a little more, but we'll have a new appendix to the code on this topic of sustainability. We'll have updates to current Appendix A, which is on nonlinear analysis, and that's a constantly evolving field, so we'll have updates there. We'll have new provisions related to development of groups of bars, and I'll talk about that a little more. We'll have a new appendix, we're calling it W for now, on performance-based wind design, as opposed to performance-based seismic design. We'll have significant revisions to the one-way shear strength provisions, and there will be a new companion code, ACI 319, on precast and pre-stressed concrete, and another companion code, 320, on post-tensioned concrete. Those codes are under completely separate development from ACI 318. I say completely separate organizationally in that they have the same standing as design codes as 318. However, there's a tremendous amount of coordination and cross-membership between 318, 319, and 320. So those are the main things that are coming, and I just want to briefly talk about each of them. I don't need to hammer home this point, but we are in a climate crisis, and concrete is getting blamed for a lot of the atmospheric carbon that's produced every year. It is true that somewhere between 6 and 8% of atmospheric carbon is produced related to cement and concrete production. In the U.S., it's actually a much lower percentage, but worldwide it's 6 to 8%. And another statistic that I found very interesting is since 1950, so that's 74 years ago, 74 years ago, the amount of cement, Portland cement produced in the world has grown by 30 times. And even since 1990, the amount of cement produced worldwide has grown by 4 times. So we are making a lot more cement than we were 75 years ago, like a lot more. And it's worthy of our attention as structural engineers to figure out what we can do to bring carbon emissions down in our field. We can do our part, and I'll explain a little bit more. This is why in ACI 318.25 we'll have a new optional appendix, Appendix N, it'll probably be called Appendix C or something like that, but for now it's called Appendix N. And the only thing that Appendix N does, I just want to emphasize this, Appendix N does not set limits on global warming potential or life cycle analysis of concrete projects. It only describes how global warming potential and life cycle analysis shall be performed for concrete structures. And what's the reason for that? We want everybody doing it the same way. If we're going to be comparing projects, comparing materials, it's up to us, ACI, to lay out a level playing field for everyone. Otherwise, if we don't do that, some other entity, organization, government or private, nonprofit or for-profit, is going to describe that, and it won't be very uniform or objective, in my opinion. So we're not setting carbon limits, we're just saying how they should be evaluated. So Appendix N is actually fairly short. It has a scope section. Then we talk about mixture sustainability measurement metrics. That is basically the global warming potential of a particular mixture. System sustainability measurements, those would be generally sort of life cycle analysis evaluations and how they should be done. And then resiliency. So resiliency depends on who you ask, but I think most people are of the opinion that resiliency is a part of sustainability, because if you have a more resilient structure, then that structure will need to be replaced less often, and it's also more resilient to disasters or long-term deterioration. So resiliency contributes to a more sustainable built environment. So that's Appendix N. Appendix A, as I mentioned, was introduced in 31819. It's currently being worked on by Subcommittee C, which deals with analysis, safety, serviceability, and analysis. Subcommittee H, which deals with seismic provisions. And then also ACI Technical Committee 374, performance-based seismic design of buildings, is assisting Subcommittee C and H with revising and updating this appendix. And this will provide a little more guidance than we have in the past for evaluation parameters for nonlinear analysis. A new subcommittee was formed, Sub-R, is looking at the relationship between the development, that is the pull-out strength or breakout strength, of a group of anchors compared to the development, again, of a group of breakout or pull-out of a group of anchors. So we have different provisions in the code for development or reinforcing and for the strength or the development of concrete anchors. And those two things, there's no obvious bridge between those. So this committee has undertaken a look at how those should relate and what's rational. And it's very useful. They've done some very interesting things with reliability of pull-out and breakout of both anchors and reinforcing bars. So there'll be a few updates to Chapter 17 related to the work of that committee. Regarding wind, a fairly recent development has been the publication of a pre-standard for performance-based wind design by the American Society of Civil Engineers. I think many of us who work in with seismic design are familiar with performance-based seismic design. ASC is obviously headed towards publishing a formal standard on performance-based wind design. And again, we, ACI, want to make sure that we are filling the need to explain how to do performance-based wind design with concrete structures. If we don't, somebody else will, and we really should be the authority on that. So this is in development. I think it's very close to being done, and you'll see that as an appendix. Performance-based wind design is generally applies only to, currently anyway, high-rise structures with concrete shear wall cores. But it's a very real thing, and it can save quite a lot of money, particularly in high wind, high seismic areas of the country. I mentioned that the one-way shear provisions are also changing. What happened was that in 318.19 we made quite a significant revision to the one-way shear capacity equations. We tried to bring together, there were, I don't know, 9 or 10 different equations in the code for calculating one-way shear capacity. We tried to unify all that. That was largely successful, except we found that for certain classes of members, and this wasn't until after 318.19 had been published, we found that for certain classes of members, those unified design provisions resulted in really very unreasonable designs. And those classes of members included tall cantilever shear walls, that is, cantilever shear walls over about, cantilever retaining walls, not shear walls. So cantilever retaining walls over about 25 or 30 feet tall. Those aren't terribly common, but they do exist. And those particular shear provisions were resulting in very thick stems at the base of the cantilever walls, and even requirements for shear reinforcement in those areas, which doesn't make sense because there are many very tall cantilever retaining walls, especially in public works projects, that are doing just fine under the old provisions. So we've been looking at that. We're going to make some revisions there. The other place that it affected design in a way that just didn't make sense was for thick foundation elements like thick spread footings. We were getting an increase in the significant increase in the thickness of the footing required if you do not want to put shear reinforcement in the footing, which is, for spread footings, that's basically what we do is make it thick enough so we don't have to put shear reinforcement in. But in order to do that, it was increasing the thickness of the spread footings. And the point made, and I thought it was a good point, is where are the failures in shear of spread footings that prompt this need to make them thicker? So we've revisited that. So we're going to adjust those things in the 2025 code. And last two slides on revisions in 25. I mentioned the formation of two new code committees, ACI 318.19 and 20. Sorry, ACI 319 and ACI 320. Precast structural concrete code and post-tension structural code. Both of those are in development or very near being finalized. The reason I mention them here is that we still retain in ACI 318 the precast and post-tension design provisions necessary for an engineer to design probably 80+% of those types of structures. We aren't shipping all those things out to another code. However, there are things that designers really need to have available, tools and methods that need to be codified to design certain kinds and certain aspects of precast, pre-stressed, and post-tension structures. So those are going into these new codes. The new codes follow the exact chapter and section structure of 318, so it will be very obvious what the linkage is between the two. And to facilitate this, we formed two new subcommittees in ACI 318.25, Sub P, which relates to the 319 work, and Sub T, which relates to the ACI 320 work. And there's a lot of cross-membership between those ACI 318 subcommittees and these separate code committees. So the coordination and balance is very good, and we're hoping that because of all that cross-population of membership, that they will be very, very well coordinated. We're trying very hard to make sure that happens. And finally, deep foundations, especially seismic design of deep foundations, has been problematic for a number of years because there are deep foundation provisions in ASCE 7, our loads code, the International Building Code, and in ACI 318. Those provisions sometimes overlap, sometimes there's gaps, sometimes they're contradictory. So the landscape for designing deep foundations has been really a mess. So these deep foundation elements, they would be piles, piers, auger cast, piers and piles. They have a lot of different design provisions floating around out there. We thought, starting actually with the NEHRP provisions development process, that we would try to unify all this in one set of regulations. And we've attempted in ACI 318-19 to bring all of those together, the ASCE, IBC, and ACI provisions, into one place, which is ACI 318. We weren't quite successful at completing that process in 2019, and we have been trying for 2025 to complete that process with the idea that these other two codes can leave the concrete design provisions for deep foundations to ACI rather than publishing their own, which are together incomplete, contradictory, and there are gaps sometimes. So we're working on that. I think that is about it. I did want to
finally,
mention,
just to finish this off, I'd like to mention something that is just...
I hate this. There's audio associated with that slide from when I pre-recorded one of these. And I don't know how many times I've removed that audio, but it's really weird to get to that slide and then hear my own voice talking to me. It's like I'm having an out-of-body experience or something. Yeah. Anyway, without showing that slide because of the audio, 318 Plus is this platform that I mentioned. It's a really useful tool. Like I said, I like paper codes, but I also love to look for keywords. If like, for instance, confinement, I'll type in confinement and find all the places in the code where the word confinement is mentioned. And it's amazing what you find when you look for keywords like that, or phrases, or whatever. You can find that particular topic in areas that you never realized were there. So it's a very useful way to explore and use the code. So that's it for my presentation. Let's see, how long did I go? Yeah, so we have, according to our schedule, we have quite a bit of time for question and answers. If there are no questions and answers, we'll just end. If we do have questions, I'm happy to stay here as long as necessary to try to address them. I saw Larry's hand go up first.
Thank you for the outstanding presentation. What she in the country, is January 2025.
Yes.
That will be for the English book. That will be Spanish and or other languages.
Yes. The version, so ACI has a whole team of people who work on translations into not only Spanish but other languages. There are various kinds of ACI translations. There are sort of officially sponsored and produced translations like the Spanish translation. There are other translations which are voluntarily undertaken by groups, usually in other countries, who are interested in seeing the ACI code translated into their language. I know that was, I believe that was for the Taiwan translation, and there's currently an effort that just kicked off for Morocco, so Moroccan French, which has its own unique aspects of translating the code, the ACI 318 code into Moroccan French. So with regard to the Spanish translation, ACI 318 Subcommittee S, which is chaired by Jose Pinchera, is working on that to the extent they can before we're done, with the English version. But their work will really kick off as soon as we get the final internally approved English version. So I would, it's a complete guess, but I would imagine the Spanish version might be out a few months after the English version. There are other versions. They usually aren't, it's usually not translated into European languages because they have the Eurocode, and so there's not much demand for, say, the code in German or French or whatever. So that's all I know. Yes? Yes, 318S.
In Spanish first, to make sure that there are many different terms in different things. As a work on the previous version, now, ACI has a these times we can take it a little bit longer. And the thing is AI get from scratch. Once we next time we will be much easier because it's building the translation language that we use.
Thank you. Yeah, I did. I don't even go to the Sub-S meetings. I try to visit all the subcommittee meetings, but I don't understand anything they're saying, so I just have to sit there and smile. I know they're telling dirty jokes, probably, is what they're doing. Okay, a bunch of questions. Let me just start. Yeah.
Why don't we have
It wasn't my idea. I'll just leave it at that. It wasn't my idea. I'll just leave it at that. No, it's for many years. There are aspects, particularly of precast concrete, that are not covered in 318 or not covered very well. Yeah, and the PCI design handbook covered those things, but it's not a code. It wasn't a code. It's a guide, very good guide, but a guide. And so building officials are saying, You can't cite that. It's not a consensus standard. Very frustrating for precast designers. So, through a long process of negotiating and setting up a structure, we created ACI, PCI code committee. So when let's see, that's 19, 319 comes out, it will, on the cover, it will say ACI, PCI, have both logos there. Same with post-tension, there'll be ACI, PTI. It's a way to get the commonly accepted and used methodologies and provisions for those kinds of design into a codified way. And I'm joking, it wasn't my idea because it's like extra work. So, but I'm optimistic that it will be a good move. It may cause some confusion initially, and we're going to have to stay right on top of the coordination between 318, 19, and 20 so we don't develop gaps or contradictions between them. Yes? Oh, with regard to deep foundation provisions, I think those are staying in Chapter 18 of ACI 318. We've been working in coordination with the Deep Foundations Institute to update all those provisions. I had that little logo of a funnel, trying to bring everything together, and we've got them involved. But that's all going into 318. So they won't see. I don't know what 319 whether they've rolled that into their provisions or not, because I'm not on 319. I'm on 318. Okay, so the subcommittee meeting for that particular provision would be subcommittee F. And if you look on the convention schedule, you'll see when subcommittee F is in Frank. Oh, I see. I believe that sub F is still dealing with those because it's the seismic design of deep foundations that is the topic that everyone's so interested in. Sub H, the seismic committee, doesn't really focus on piles or deep foundations. Sub F is the foundations committee. They're the ones focusing on deep foundations. So if you want to get in touch with somebody or go to their meeting, I would find that meeting in the schedule, go to that meeting. The chair of Sub F is Carlos Ospina. And you can also, I'm sure, just email him. He's a member, if you go into the member directory, you can find out from him directly what's going on with that. Yeah.
But I want Andy did an outstanding presentation. Please,